They laughed as they cuffed him, calling him a nobody. But when the badge hidden in his pocket was revealed, the entire precinct was seconds away from a reckoning they'd never forget. The midday sun cast sharp shadows on the bustling city street, where cars honked impatiently and pedestrians moved in hurried strides. A vibrant mix of businessmen, tourists, and locals filled the sidewalks, weaving around each other like a living tapestry of urban life. Vendors shouted their daily specials, a street musician strummed a soft melody on his guitar, and somewhere, a child's laughter rang out. Among the crowd, a tall black man walked with measured steps. His presence was unassuming, clad in a simple button-down shirt and dark jeans. His shoulders were broad, his posture upright, and his eyes carried a quiet authority, though no one seemed to notice. He wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, just another face blending into the chaos of the city. A few feet away, a group of police officers stood near a parked patrol car, engaged in what seemed to be a casual exchange. One of them, Officer Callahan, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetual smirk, leaned against the hood of the vehicle, scanning the crowd like a predator, surveying potential prey. His gaze landed on the man in the button-down. Something about him made Callahan's lips curl into a sneer. He nudged his partner, Officer Davis. "Hey, doesn't that guy match the description we got earlier?" Davis barely looked up from his coffee. "What guy?" "The suspect from the gas station robbery," Callahan said, straightening up. "Black male, about 6 foot, dark shirt." Davis finally glanced over. "Come on, Callahan. That's half the damn city." But Callahan was already moving, striding across the pavement with the confidence of someone who never doubted his own authority. Davis hesitated for a moment before following. A young woman working the corner coffee cart watched the two officers approach the man in the button-down. Something about it made her uneasy. The way the man carried himself. It wasn't fear, wasn't avoidance. He simply turned his head slightly, as if sensing them before they even reached him. She had seen a lot from her cart. Fights, arguments, even the occasional arrest. But something about this felt off. "Excuse me, sir." Callahan's voice was firm, loud enough to turn a few heads. "Can you stop right there?" The man slowed his steps but didn't immediately stop. Instead, he exhaled through his nose, as if already anticipating what was about to happen. "I said stop." This time, he halted. He turned toward them slowly, his expression unreadable. "ID," Callahan demanded, already eyeing the man like he was guilty of something. The man's brows lifted slightly, his lips parting, as if he might say something. But then he simply reached into his back pocket. Slow, deliberate movements. A second officer, Rookie Thompson, shifted uneasily. Something about this didn't feel right. The man's body language. It wasn't defensive, wasn't nervous. It was controlled, purposeful. But before the man could even retrieve his wallet, Callahan lost his patience. "Hands where I can see them." The man froze, his gaze locking onto Callahan's. For a moment, there was silence. Then, in a slow, careful voice, he said, "I am reaching for my ID." Callahan didn't care. In one swift movement, he grabbed the man's arm, yanking it behind his back. Davis stepped in, pushing the man forward, slamming him against the patrol car's hood. Gasps rippled through the bystanders, a few people pulling out their phones to record. "Hey, what the hell?" someone shouted. The man didn't resist, but there was something unsettling about how calm he remained. Even as Callahan snapped the cuffs onto his wrists, even as people around them began murmuring in protest. Officer Thompson, still standing a few feet away, couldn't shake the feeling that they had just made a terrible mistake. Then, he saw it. As Callahan reached into the man's pocket, a glint of metal caught the sunlight. A badge. Not just any badge. Sheriff Elijah Boone. His stomach dropped. Before he could open his mouth to say anything, the radio on Callahan's hip crackled to life. "Callahan Davis, whatever you're doing, stop immediately. Release him now." The shift in the air was instant. The laughter, the arrogance, it drained from Callahan's face in a heartbeat. Boone finally spoke, his voice steady, cold. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." The weight of the handcuffs pressed into Sheriff Elijah Boone's wrists, but his face remained composed, his breath steady. Around him, the city's rhythm didn't stop. Cars still moved, pedestrians still weaved through the streets. But there was a noticeable shift. A murmur ran through the crowd. More phones were raised. The air crackled with tension. Officer Callahan, oblivious to the gravity of his mistake, tightened his grip on Boone's arm, pushing him harder against the patrol car. His grin widened, a smug satisfaction radiating off him. "You're real quiet now, huh?" Callahan taunted. "You had a lot to say a minute ago." Boone said nothing. He didn't struggle, didn't plead. He simply watched, calculating. Officer Davis, standing to the side, glanced nervously at the growing audience. He wasn't as cocky as Callahan, but he wasn't about to challenge him either. Rookie Thompson, on the other hand, looked downright sick. His fingers twitched at his belt, eyes darting from Boone to the badge still resting in Callahan's grip. "Hey, Callahan," Thompson started, voice unsteady. "What?" Callahan snapped, clearly enjoying himself. "I think—" But before he could finish, the radio on Callahan's hip crackled again. This time the voice was sharp, urgent. "Callahan, Davis, you need to release him, now." Callahan scoffed, pressing the radio's button. "What? We just picked up a—" "I said release him." The voice was unmistakable. Chief Daniel Whitaker. Callahan's smirk faltered. Davis's eyes widened. Thompson swallowed hard. Slowly, Boone turned his head, just enough to look Callahan directly in the eye. The smirk was gone now, replaced by something colder. "I warned you," Boone said, his voice quiet but razor-sharp. Callahan's grip slackened, confusion flickering across his face. He looked down at the badge in his hand, the weight of realization settling in. But he wasn't ready to back down just yet. "No way," he muttered under his breath. "No damn way." A black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb. The door swung open with force, and out stepped Chief Whitaker. His face was a storm of barely restrained fury. The crowd instinctively parted as he strode forward, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement like gunshots. His eyes locked onto Boone, then shifted to Callahan, burning with disbelief. "What the hell have you done?" Whitaker's voice was low, dangerous. Callahan swallowed, his bravado crumbling. "Chief, Take those cuffs off," Whitaker ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Davis scrambled to obey, fumbling with the keys as he unlocked Boone's restraints. The second the cuffs clicked open, Boone flexed his wrists, rolling his shoulders back as if shaking off an invisible weight. For the first time since the arrest, his face changed. The quiet patience, the eerie stillness, it all faded, replaced by something sharp, unyielding. Callahan opened his mouth, maybe to justify, maybe to apologize, but Boone cut him off with a look. "You put your hands on me," Boone said, voice even, almost conversational. "You humiliated me in front of all these people. You didn't listen. You didn't ask questions. You assumed." Callahan flinched as if struck. "You thought I was just another black man on the street," Boone continued, stepping forward. Callahan instinctively stepped back. "You thought you had control, that you could do whatever you wanted and walk away without consequences." Whitaker turned to his officers. "You just arrested the sheriff of Fulton County." His voice carried over the crowd, like a hammer striking steel. The highest-ranking law enforcement officer in this district. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. A few exchanged stunned glances. Others whispered among themselves. Some just kept recording. Boone leaned in slightly, his voice dropping low. "You didn't just arrest the wrong man," he said. "You just put your whole damn career in a coffin." Callahan's face drained of color. Boone finally turned to Whitaker. "What's it gonna be, Chief?" Whitaker hesitated only for a second. Then, his jaw tightened. "Callahan. Davis." Both officers straightened, still rattled. "You're suspended, effective immediately." Callahan's mouth fell open. "What? Chief, I don't want to hear it." Whitaker's voice was steel. "You disrespected a superior officer. You violated protocol. You embarrassed this department in front of half the damn city." Thompson exhaled sharply, relief evident in his face. Boone took one last look at Callahan, who stood there, frozen, his entire world crumbling beneath him, then turned away. With a nod to Whitaker, he walked toward his SUV. The crowd slowly began to part again, murmurs still buzzing through the air, phones still recording. And as Sheriff Elijah Boone pulled open his car door, sliding into the driver's seat, he spoke one final sentence. "Next time, pick your target wisely." Then, without another glance, he drove off, leaving behind a shattered career, a humiliated officer, and a lesson neither Callahan nor the entire precinct would ever forget. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. Sheriff Elijah Boone had left, his warning echoing in the silence he left behind. But the city street was still alive with murmurs, whispers, and the whirring of phone cameras capturing every second. Callahan stood rigid, his face pale, his mind racing. Suspended. The word rang in his ears like a death sentence. Just moments ago, he had felt invincible, standing over a man he believed to be powerless. Now, his own career hung by a thread. Whitaker turned to the remaining officers, his gaze locking onto Rookie Thompson. "Get these people moving," he ordered. "We're not putting on a damn show." Thompson hesitated before nodding, turning toward the gathered crowd. "All right, folks, let's clear out. Nothing more to see here." But there was plenty more to see. A woman with dark curls and sharp eyes, phone still recording, stepped forward. "Oh, there's plenty more to see. The world just saw one of your own abuse his power. You think telling us to move along is going to erase that?" Others murmured in agreement. A man in a gray hoodie shook his head. "Nah, man. You don't get to just sweep this under the rug." A suited businessman muttered under his breath. They really thought they could get away with this in broad daylight. Officer Davis shifted uneasily, sweat forming at his temples. His eyes flickered toward Callahan, who still stood frozen, fists clenched. Whitaker let out a sharp breath, ignoring the bystanders. He had bigger problems. "Callahan, Davis." His voice was steel. "Inside, now." Callahan finally moved, his legs feeling like lead, as he followed Whitaker and Davis into the precinct, his mind still scrambling for a way out of this. Inside the station, the mood was darker, heavier. Every officer had seen the video by now. Some stared as Callahan walked past. Others whispered in hushed tones. He felt their eyes, felt their judgment. The chief led them into his office and slammed the door shut. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Whitaker's voice was dangerously low. Callahan straightened his spine, trying to regain his composure. "Chief, I thought he was—" "You thought?" Whitaker cut him off, his expression unreadable. "You didn't confirm. You didn't ask questions. You saw a black man, and you assumed." Davis stood stiff beside Callahan, his jaw tight, but he didn't speak. Callahan's temper flared. "With all due respect, Chief," He didn't even identify himself. Whitaker's eyes darkened. He shouldn't have had to. Silence. Callahan's pulse pounded. It's just a misunderstanding. Whitaker let out a slow, heavy breath. Do you even know who Elijah Boone is? Callahan hesitated. You don't, do you? Whitaker's voice was almost pitying. He's not just the sheriff of Fulton County. He's a decorated officer. He trained half the damn SWAT team in this state. He's been in law enforcement longer than you've been alive, Callahan. Something in Callahan's stomach twisted. Whitaker continued. And thanks to you, we're now a headline. The entire internet has the footage. The mayor's office has already called. Internal Affairs is launching an investigation. He leaned in, his voice deadly quiet. Do you get it now? Callahan opened his mouth, then closed it. Davis finally spoke. Chief, are we fired? Whitaker exhaled through his nose, the muscles in his jaw twitching. Not yet, but don't get comfortable. A sharp knock on the door interrupted them. The door swung open, and in walked Captain Rivera, head of Internal Affairs. She was a woman of few words, but when she spoke, people listened. She wasted no time. Callahan, Davis, your badges and service weapons. Now. The room fell into a tense silence. Callahan's face went pale. You can't be serious. Rivera didn't blink. I am. Davis swallowed. Then, without a word, unclipped his badge, placed it on the chief's desk, and followed with his holstered gun. Callahan hesitated. His mind screamed at him to fight back, to argue, to plead. But there was nothing left to say. With shaking hands, he removed his badge and gun, setting them beside Davis's. Rivera picked them up. You'll be contacted soon. Stay reachable. She glanced at Whitaker, then left the room without another word. Callahan slumped into the nearest chair, his hands running through his hair. This can't be happening. Whitaker leaned against his desk, arms crossed. You did this to yourself. Callahan looked up, desperation flickering in his eyes. Chief, I can't save you from this, Whitaker said, his voice final. Callahan's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Davis turned toward the window, watching the people outside the station. Some were still gathered, talking in low voices, showing videos to one another. A career had just crumbled in front of the entire city, and Callahan, once the officer who walked these halls with unchecked arrogance, now sat in silence, realizing too late that there was no way out of this. The precinct had never been this quiet. The air was thick, suffocating, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but filled with the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. Callahan sat motionless, his hands still gripping the edges of his chair, like a man dangling over the edge of a cliff. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in, slow, merciless, and irreversible. Across the room, Chief Whitaker remained standing, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. Davis had backed away to the far end, his face blank, his shoulders tense. The door to the office was still slightly ajar, a reminder that the entire station had likely heard everything. And then, just when Callahan thought the worst had passed, the door opened again. A shadow fell across the threshold. Sheriff Elijah Boone stepped inside. The air shifted instantly, an invisible force that made everyone in the room straighten. Boone's presence wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive. He didn't need it to be. He carried authority the way a storm carried thunder, heavy and inevitable. Whitaker exhaled, slow and measured. Sheriff Boone. Boone didn't acknowledge him at first. His gaze was locked onto Callahan. Callahan felt that stare like a blade pressed against his skin. He wanted to look away, wanted to disappear into his own regret, but he couldn't move. Boone took a step forward, his voice, when he spoke, was calm, controlled, and somehow that was worse. "You like feeling powerful, don't you?" Boone said, his tone devoid of anger, but laced with something far more dangerous: disappointment. Callahan swallowed, but no words came out. Boone continued, "You thought you had me, thought you could throw me against a car, put me in cuffs, and that would be the end of it." He let the words settle. "But power is earned, officer, not taken." Callahan's hands curled into fists. "Don't," Boone interrupted, his voice sharper now. "Don't insult both of us by trying to justify it." The room held its breath. Boone stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. "You didn't just try to humiliate me today," he said. "You humiliated yourself. You proved to the world exactly the kind of cop you are." Callahan's jaw tightened, his pulse hammering. Boone's eyes never wavered. But here's the thing about moments like this: they don't just disappear. He glanced toward the window, where the city still bustled outside, unaware of the reckoning happening within these four walls. They stay. They define you. And long after you leave this department, long after that badge is no longer on your chest, people will remember this. Callahan's breathing was uneven. He knew Boone was right. The silence stretched. Then, Whitaker spoke. "Sheriff Boone, what do you want to do?" Boone exhaled, as if considering. His gaze drifted from Callahan to Davis, then back again. For a long, terrifying second, no one knew what he would say. Then, Boone simply nodded once. "I don't need to do anything," he said. He already did it to himself. The words cut deeper than any punishment ever could. Boone turned without another word, heading for the door. But just before stepping out, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. His final words were barely above a whisper, but they landed with the force of a bullet. "Next time you put your hands on someone, make sure you know who you're dealing with." And with that, he was gone. The door swung shut behind Sheriff Elijah Boone, but the echo of his words lingered like smoke in the air. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire precinct was waiting for something, some kind of reprieve, some way to undo what had already been set in motion. But there was no undoing it. Callahan sat slumped in his chair, his face drained of the arrogance that once fueled him. His whole body was stiff, his hands gripping his knees, as if grounding himself from the weight of his own downfall. The silence around him was suffocating, not because of what had been said, but because of what hadn't. His career was over. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but the damage was done. Chief Whitaker finally broke the silence. His voice was cold, measured. "I expect your resignation on my desk by the end of the week." Callahan flinched. His fingers twitched. "Chief, please, Whitaker's expression didn't change. "Save it." Davis, who had remained silent this entire time, exhaled slowly and glanced at Callahan. There was no sympathy in his eyes, just understanding. Because deep down, Callahan had done this to himself. A sharp knock on the door. Captain Rivera stepped in, holding a thick file in one hand, her eyes scanning the room. "I will be finishing the investigation, but let's be honest, we already know where this is going." She didn't wait for an answer. "The mayor wants a statement from you, Chief. Public trust is hanging by a thread." Whitaker gave a curt nod, but his gaze remained on Callahan. "This department doesn't protect bad cops." Callahan let out a shaky breath, but the fight had drained out of him. He knew there was no saving himself. Not this time. Rivera turned, already making her way out, and Whitaker followed, pausing only to throw one last glance over his shoulder. "Clean out your locker." Then He was gone. Callahan didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the floor, realizing too late that power, once abused, had a way of slipping through your fingers like sand. The precinct was quieter than it had ever been. Callahan sat alone, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like an anchor. Outside, life moved on. People walked the streets, cars honked impatiently, and the city continued without him, without his badge, without his authority. Sheriff Elijah Boone, on the other hand, didn't look back. As he stepped into his SUV, he exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the last remnants of the encounter. He hadn't needed to raise his voice, hadn't needed to threaten or demand justice. The truth had done all the work for him. As he pulled into traffic, his phone buzzed. A message from a fellow officer. "It's all over the news. You handled it like a pro." Boone smirked to himself, shaking his head. He wasn't looking for praise. He just wanted respect, the same respect that should be given to anyone, regardless of uniform, title, or skin color. Meanwhile, across the city, people were already discussing what had happened. The footage had gone viral, sparking debates, outrage, and, most importantly, conversations about accountability. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about Callahan. It was about power, perception, and the choices we make when we think no one is watching. So now, the question is, what do you think? Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power like this? What would you have done in Boone's situation? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you want more real stories that make you think, hit that like button, share this video, and don't forget to subscribe. You never know what eye-opening story we'll tell next.